Hi again, let's continue learning variations in the Sicilian defense. And we're gonna take a look at the Sveshnikov variation. So let's play the move e4, then after c5, knight to f3. Here black plays the move knight to c6, and after d4, takes and takes. Here we have already seen the move g6, which leads to the accelerated dragon. But here black has other options. One of them is the move knight to c6, which is even more natural to develop a knight and attack the pawn on e4. And here we're gonna play the move knight to c3. By the way, here taking on c6 is not a good idea. Remember that in general this move is not particularly strong because it improves black's pawns. Black can take with the b pawn and bring pawns towards the center. And here playing the move e5 looks aggressive, but again we have this typical idea, queen to a5, which gives a fork to the pawn and the king. So here black is winning a pawn and getting a better position. So always be alert about this e5 move. Make sure that black doesn't have this tactic, which is very typical, this queen a5 check, winning a pawn. In any case, knight c3 is very natural. We develop. And here black has many possible options, but here we're going to focus on the most popular move in this position, which is the move e5. By the way, playing here a move like d6 will transpose into the classical variation, but e5 is the move that leads to the Sveshnikov variation, which is a variation named after a chess player called Evgeny Sveshnikov. And here we need to be particularly careful because here there's pretty much only one move to really test this variation that black is playing, which is the move knight d to b5. Let's quickly evaluate other alternatives to see why other alternatives are not that good. Playing knight to b3 here just gives black very good play, very easy play after bishop to b4, pinning the knight, planning to take on e4, and if we defend that pawn, then black can play d5. Remember d5, if black can play it under good conditions, black gets a great position. Here, black is just developing all the pieces, controlling the center. So black is probably already better in this position. Other options like knight to f5 might be an idea, but this square has been weakened, but black has ideas to control it with g6. But even in this particular position, black has again the typical reply d5. With the idea that if we take on d5, then black simply gets the knight. And after taking on c6, black can trade queens or take on c6 and get a very good position. For example, after taking, knight takes, black takes with the pawn. Even though black potentially might have a weak pawn on c6, black has much better development and it's already attacking this pawn on c2, so black is doing perfectly fine here. So after e5, remember that you need to evaluate the position. So sometimes with the pawn on a6, you need to move the knight to one square. If black doesn't play the move a6, normally you will place the knight to b5 with the idea to invade on d6, because this move e5, remember that it has some disadvantages like weakening the d5 square. Here we also have this idea of invading on d6. That's why in this position, pretty much always black plays the move d6, avoiding that invasion. So if black just ignores this idea, for example playing a6, then we would just give a check. Black doesn't want to move the king and have a weak king on the center, that's why here black will take. And here we see that this queen is quite annoying there. Black will normally try to exchange queens or to attack that queen in order to castle. So queen to e7 is the logical follow-up. And here white can simply trade queens. And white really gets an advantage pretty much for free, because white has two bishops that can become quite strong. And we can see that the dark squares have been weakened quite a lot. So after white takes either with the king or with the knight, let's say knight takes e7, white gets maybe not a large advantage, but white gets a very stable advantage. So white has pretty much everything in this position. So this is not a position that black wants to go for. That's why here black will play d6, avoiding that invasion. And here the most common move is bishop to g5, which is also very logical because we want to exploit this weak square on d5. So bishop to g5 makes a lot of sense. Just want to briefly mention that knight to d5 is becoming more popular on top players, but this leads to very different play. That's why we're going to focus on bishop to g5. We are pinning the knight. Here we have a very serious threat of knight to d5, taking advantage of the pin, and then we can give a check with the knight, for example after bishop to e7, which your opponent might play because this looks natural. You can simply take on f6. That's why after bishop to g5, black has to be careful. Black plays the move a6, attacking this knight on b5. And here we're going to retreat, knight to a3. And here again, black has to be a bit careful. Natural moves here don't work very well. So black normally here plays the move b5. Another idea, for example, playing bishop to e6, might make sense to develop and cover the d5 square. But here we can play the move knight to c4. So this knight on a3 is our worst piece. We want to improve it. That's why here we play knight to c4. And later on we might take on f6, bring the knight to e3, and we see that the knights will occupy the d5 square. So here we can get a slight advantage. That's why black normally doesn't play this way. So after knight to a3, black plays this move b5. Normally moving pawns in the opening, making lots of pawn moves is not good because we might end up underdeveloped. But here this move has a very concrete idea of controlling c4, and also b4 is a threat, forking these two knights. And here white has two main continuations. One of them is to take on f6, and the other one is to play knight to d5, which will lead to very different play. If we take on f6, here black doesn't want to take with the queen because white will gain tempi after knight to d5, attacking the queen. That's why normally black takes with the pawn, which has some advantages even though it damages the pawn structure. Black can follow up with f5 and fight for the center. And this leads to very different positions that we're not going to focus on. We're going to focus on the other option, which is to play the move knight to d5, which I think is more classical, more natural. Taking into account that the Sveshnikov is not the main line in the Sicilian, I think that playing natural moves against it makes a lot of sense. Not prepare very complex lines. That's why after knight to d5, we're putting pressure on f6, and this whole line will revolve around gaining control of the d5 square, which is a very principled approach because we want to punish black for that move for e5, or at least we want to try to punish black for that. And here black normally continues with bishop to e7. Just want to briefly mention that another way to break this pin on the knight is to play queen to a5, which is normally not played very often. Black is giving a check, and now there's an idea to take on e4. That's why we're going to continue with bishop to d2. And here black doesn't have anything better than to go back to d8. So here if you want to repeat moves, we can play bishop to g5 and get the same position. But in general, when you play as white, you want to try to fight for an advantage. So here we're going to continue with knight takes f6. There's also a sharper move, which is c4. And after knight takes, c takes b5, we get a very complicated position. But again, considering that this line is really a sideline, because here we're talking about a rare move in the Sveshnikov, here you can also play in simpler fashion, just take on f6. And here black doesn't want to take with the pawn, because here black doesn't get the bishop pair in this position. So here black doesn't want to damage the pawn structure. Here black will normally take with the queen. And here you can simply continue with bishop to d3. And then you will castle and play the move c4. We'll see that this idea of playing c4 is a very typical idea in this line. So here you get a very solid position, very easy to play. You're simply developing pieces. So this is what I suggest that you play against queen to a5 ideas. So going back to this position, queen to a5 is not the main move, but I just want you to be aware of this move. Here black will normally break the pin with bishop to e7, which is the most logical move. And here we're going to take the knight. We could take on e7 with the knight, but normally we want to keep the knight on d5. Remember that our main idea here is try to exploit this weakness on d5. So here we're going to take the knight with the bishop, because the black's knight was controlling d5. And here black will normally take with the bishop, because taking with the pawn makes less sense, because black normally wants to develop the bishop to g7 when taking with the pawn. So black will normally here capture with the bishop. Here you could simply continue, for example, with bishop to d3, and it's going to be very hard for black to play f5, which is the idea that black wants to play whenever black takes with the pawn. So here you already have an advantage. That's why here black will pretty much always take with the bishop. And here we're going to play the move c4. c3 is another move that can be played in this position, but we're going to play the move c4, which is an alternative, which according to my database, it scores better for white. c4 is even very straightforward. We just plan to take on b5, and what I like about this line is that it limits black's options a lot. Here black is normally going to play the move b4, at least if black is a strong player. Because taking on c4 definitely helps you develop. Now this bishop is becoming very active. And playing knight to d4 is an idea, but this would involve sacrificing a pawn, so here you can simply take on b5 and then not get too greedy after taking b5 once. If black takes on b5, then you can definitely get a pawn there, but otherwise you can just develop bishop to d3 and castle. This is a typical idea, sacrificing a pawn, but in this particular position I'm not sure if black has good compensation, so here you can simply take the pawn and get at least a slight advantage. That's why black will normally play b4, and now we're going to play knight to c2. So we have improved the knight a lot, because the knight on a3 was not doing much, but now this knight on c2 is controlling d4, so the knight cannot jump, or at least we can exchange knights if the knight goes d4, and the knight might also sometimes support the knight on d5, so this knight might come to e3. So here black plays a5 because we are attacking the pawn on b4, and here white has a few alternatives. g3 is possible, but in the model game white simply continue with bishop to e2, and after castles and castles, black plays bishop to g5. This is also a typical idea. Black wants to improve the bishop on this diagonal. The bishop was doing nothing on f6. And here white continue playing very natural moves. Queen to d3. This is what I like about playing in this way, because it's just pretty natural. Objectively, maybe white doesn't have an advantage, because black still has a very solid position, but potentially we might get an advantage. So far we have this very nice knight on d5, and we can develop very quickly. On the other hand, black has the bishop pair, so the position is more or less balanced. The model game continued rook to b8, and white played rook a to d1, g6, b3, just fixing the pawns on the queen side, bishop to e6, bishop to f3, rook to b7, queen e2, black played knight to e7, trying to exchange this knight on d5, but here white simply took on e7, and after queen takes, rook to d3. Now white is planning two double rooks on the d file, trying to attack this pawn. On d6, this is another target, this backward pawn on d6, and in the end white managed to win the game. So we have studied the Sveshnikov variation, which is a line that we reach after the move knight to f6, knight to c3, and e5. This is an interesting line for black, but it has some disadvantages, like weakening the d5 square, and this is what you should mainly focus on when playing against this line.